On behalf of the Board of the Directors of the American College Alumni Association, I'm pleased to welcome you to this unique Louvain Alumni Virtual Reunion webinar for 2021. American College alumni and friends are joining us from various time zones around the globe, and we are pleased to have this special opportunity to hear from one of our distinguished alumnus, Dr. Joseph Selling. He is Professor Emeritus of Theological Ethics at the KUL, and Dr. Selling will speak on the timely topic of theology, ethics in a time of crisis, how the pandemic revealed a weakness in traditional moral thinking. Throughout his academic career at the KUL from 1978 to 2011, Dr. Selling explored and continues to explore many principles of Christian ethics. Considering the coronavirus pandemic, many ethical and moral questions have been raised, not only in the medical field, but also in the areas of human relations, justice, and religious faith. Dr. Selling will help us reflect today on the fractures in our human family and our systems of ethical thought revealed in this extraordinary period of world history. Having taken two of Professor Selling's courses in the early 1990s, I know that we were in for a treat that will both challenge us to think critically and reflect pastorally. Now, alumni and friends of the American College, the board is pleased to present Dr. Joseph Selling.
Ethics in a time of crisis. Sorry, how the pandemic revealed a weakness in traditional moral thinking. Perhaps as when I put something like this together, I tinker with it all the time until I actually present it. And I've actually made a few changes today just to try and make it clearer. Maybe even the title itself is not necessarily just about revealing a weakness, but it's bringing to light a contrast between two different approaches of how we do Christian ethics. And what I'm going to describe is that the more traditional approach has revealed, or now that we see that it could not deal with some of these issues, that there is a certain weakness in the system. What is that weakness, and is there an alternative way to approach Christian ethics that does not necessarily suffer from that weakness? So the first thing I'm going to say, even before I start, I know I've been talking already, is I'm going to ask you, please try to follow without taking detailed notes, because if you would like to receive a copy of the printouts of the slides, I have them. They are all printed out, the finished versions. All you have to do is send me an email, josephselling@kuleuven.be, and tell me you would like a copy of the slides themselves. If you actually want the PowerPoint and you have a reason for asking for that, let me know and I will send that to you as well. Okay, so let's get started, because I'm going to cover a bit of material here. That's why I'm asking you not to try and take notes, and I'm going to try and move along. But I don't want to go too fast. I want it to sink in. Yeah. Okay, so if we're going to talk about what has happened in general, we got to start with what most of us consider to be ethics in general, or Christian ethics more specifically, in normal times. What does that mean, ethics in normal times? Well, basically, it means good is to be done and pursued, and evil is to be avoided. Do good, avoid evil. This quote, good is to be done and evil, good is to be done and pursued, is actually taken here. You can tell I'm a KUL professor, I got a footnote on this. This is actually Thomas Aquinas' definition of the first principle of natural law, which you can find in the Prima Secundae, question 94, article 2. Just as a kind of sidebar here, it occurred to me that, a lot of traditional morality, especially in the Catholic Church, is built on natural law. If natural law is so important, why is it that through the entire Summa Theologica, all four parts of it, one, Prima Secundae, and the third part, why is it there's only one single question about natural law? That is, it doesn't come back. It's not really a solid foundation for what he's doing. Thomas's biggest foundation for what he is doing is ethics, and that's the whole of the Secunda Secundae. It's all built on ethics. Okay, that said, good is to be done and pursued, evil is to be avoided. But the question then becomes what constitutes good and what constitutes evil? What is good and what is evil? For Thomas Aquinas, some of this was pretty simple because he had a different view of creation. He had a different view of God. He had a different view of the relationship between God and creation. The Bible was interpreted literally in these medieval times, okay? He saw God as putting creation together in a particular way. And if God put it together in a particular way, it should probably stay that way. Well, we look at things a little bit differently. Sometimes if people get ill and they die, this is God's will that they should get ill and die. When people get ill, we send them to the hospital and we try to stop them from dying. Part of that is because we have the means to do it, but another more fundamental part is we don't believe that just because it looks like people are going to die, that we just sit back and say, well, it must be their time. God decided that. No, we don't. We try to intervene. We try to change nature. We intervene in nature. Our understanding of what nature is very different than it was in medieval times. So if we say that good is to be done and evil is to be avoided, we still have the problem of determining what is good and what is evil. How do we know this? Now, I'm looking at this from normal morality, more traditional morality as it occurred throughout most of our history that we're conscious of, and I'll get to that in a moment. We're going to look at how the textbook tradition, how does this work in the textbook tradition? How do we determine what is moral and what is not moral? Okay, quite simple. It has to do with some statement that tells us this is good, that is not good. This is good, this is evil. This is good, this is right. Some statement that says that. Obviously, in commandments, do this, do not, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, etc., etc. But what I've done here is I've given you 5 synonyms. And the reason for that is because they all have different kinds of connotations. On the right-hand side, you have guidelines. And guidelines are kind of general. They're sort of vague. A guideline, you should always ask a reasonable price for whatever it is you're trying to sell. Okay, but it doesn't tell you what that reasonable price is. And it doesn't tell you who you're selling it to or what this is going to mean in terms of making enough profit so that you can make your product better, etc. It's a general kind of thing. Rules become explicit. Rules become something much more specific, right? And they are pointing to how most people run the game, if you will. Norms I like right in the middle because norms are expressions that we understand, that we apply to ourselves, that our culture understands and carries, okay? Laws now become much more objective. They're written, they come from an external source, and they are imposed upon us, okay? These are more strict things, and of course, the ultimate strict thing is the commandments. Commandments will tell us what is right or wrong. Really, to what extent, as I like to point out to new students, we think of 10 commandments. If you're Jewish, there are 613 commandments that tells you which plants should go in which field, what kind of material should you do to make your clothes, et cetera, right down to the detail, the vast majority of which we've just forgotten about and they're irrelevant to us. The point here is that there's a spectrum of those statements that tell us this is good and this is evil. The one in the middle is the one that I like to go for. We talk about moral norms. That's not an uncommon expression. I like that word norms because it is very close to the concept of normality. What happens in a normal life? What happens in normal circumstances? So what do norms tell us? Quite simply, they say, do this, don't do that. There's a source of saying something is good, do this because it is good. Don't do that because it is evil. So whatever is said is evil, you should not do it. Doing this leads to a concept of obligation, and not doing something leads to a concept of prohibition. The norm says, do this, don't do that. Both of them all center around the concept of behavior. Normative ethics is generally an ethics of behavior. We have good behaviors, we have bad behaviors. We have behaviors that involve good elements, behaviors that involve bad elements. Okay, that said now, This is the center. What I'm putting forth is the first concept of morality. It is based upon behavior and the rules or the norms or the laws that govern them. So we come to the question, why does Catholic theology of norms focus so exclusively on behavior? Well, in order to understand that, you have to go back to, you have to go back to the Council of Trent, 1545 to 63. The Council of Trent is the beginning of systematic theology. There was theology around before, but it was not systematic. It wasn't consistent. It wasn't consistently shared throughout the whole of Christianity. It wasn't even consistently shared sometimes for one day. The problem the Council of Trent was addressing was, everyone will tell you, the Reformation. That's right. But why did the Reformation exist? It existed because the church was a mess at the time. We had different sets of rules applied in different kinds of ways. And what the church really was lacking was some kind of consistency. Want to know more about that? Here's a wonderful little book by John O'Malley called What Happened at Vatican II. It'll give you a very, very nice description of that. Why did Trent take place? Okay, Trent looked at the situation, said, we need to get our act together. We need to do things consistently. It led to the creation of seminaries, the places where priestly training would take place. It led to the standardization of curricula for all the branches of theology. There are moral textbooks, dogmatic textbooks, liturgical textbooks, etc. But they're all standard now. It led to a standardized forms of celebrating the sacraments. Before Trent, how the Eucharist was celebrated was not universal. It was not always adhered to. Many of the people of the clergy before the Council of Trent, before this new process of educating them, some of them didn't even understand Latin. They couldn't really understand the prayers at the Eucharist. We are focused in theological ethics, of course, we are focused on the practice of confession, the sacrament whereby one seeks the forgiveness of sins. The practice of confession starts how? With a penitent enumerating sins. Bless me, Father, I have sinned. I did this, I did that. I failed to do something that I was supposed to do. Okay? This leads to, it assumes that sin is what the penitent did and failed to do. Notice the emphasis is on behavior. The penitent reports these things in terms of acts or omissions, while at the same time intentions and circumstances become details that have an impact not on the sin, but they only have an impact on the sinner's accountability and on the type of penance that will ultimately be given. If you follow later teaching through the handbooks, you'll see the only thing that is really important is the behavior, the acts and the omissions that a person performs. Okay. What we needed then was a standardized curricula so that moral theology could be taught the same way universally in every diocese, in every seminary, in every institution of Catholic education. So we come to the standardized curricula for all branches of theology. And what I want to draw your attention to is the fact that this is, I'm looking at my notes here because I am missing things on the right-hand side of my screen. It says, an enormous project that takes decades to organize the diocese, to build seminaries, to construct curricula, and to write the text to be used for instruction. Little sidebar here, but what I mean by organized diocese is to get everybody on board, to get all the bishops to agree, yes, we are going to accept this curriculum. Yes, we're going to build seminaries. Yes, we are all going to teach the same thing. This takes time. It didn't happen the year after the Council of Trent finished. It took a great deal of things to do, okay? And that includes what happened in what we call moral theology. Now, what I'm going to do next, I want to give you a little bit of warning. Don't read it, okay? This is what's called, there are things on the internet, on YouTube you can find, it's called death by PowerPoint. And death by PowerPoint is when people put huge amounts of text up on the screen and they're expecting, and then they read it for you. I don't want that to happen now. But there are three important elements that I want you to consider. How did this come about? How did we get to a textbook for moral theology? Well, we got three main characters that I'm singling out. The first one is Johannes Azor. He was a philosopher and theologian, okay? And he was part of what was called the Ratio Studiorum. This was a group of people, a committee, if you will, that was trying to construct what the structure of moral theology would look like. He was part of that, okay? And he came up with his own version of how to bring all of moral theology together into one text, into one vision, etc. He created one called the Institutionem Moralium, which was published in between 1610 and 1611. Now it says here that he died in 1603, and the published volume of the Institutionem Moralium in 1610 to 11 is actually the copy that I had. This was published after his death. The Library of the Faculty of Theology does not have the original version that was published. They have the version of 1610 to 1611. Okay, this text is 3,016 pages long. It comes in a folio about that big and about that wide. There are three of them, okay? There's lots of material in there. There's lots of references in there, and it's very interesting. What's significant, it is the first attempt to standardize an approach to Roman Catholic moral theology. But obviously, who could use it? This was just completely unrealistic. 3,000-page textbooks being produced for every single seminary, not going to work, okay? So what happens later is that the Jesuit Hermann Bussbaum created a shorter text, which he called the Medulla Theologiae Moralis. He wrote that somewhere between, it appeared between 1645 and 1650. This text was so popular, it was used in almost all seminaries, almost all seminarians or student priests use this textbook. There are 200 editions of this textbook. Sometimes the next edition, they're like class notes. If you were in Leuven at the time we were publishing class notes, you remember they came out every year. Sometimes they were the same thing that the professor did the year before. Sometimes some things were changed, etc. That's what these textbooks were like. So you've got Bussbaum's book, which became a standard for this discipline of moral theology right through the church. And it could be that, of course, because it was written in Latin, which supposedly everybody understood. And then the third person I want to name is Jean-Pierre Rouy, who was a Jesuit in France. And he wrote the first, what we could call the modern textbook. It was heavily based upon Bussbaum's text, but there's a lot of new things in it. For instance, there's much more work on canon law. Guri introduces this notion of the principle of double effect, for instance, which the textbooks in moral theology took for granted. Okay, that was the third phase of the development of handbooks. Like I said, I don't want to waste too much time on this. You can yourself look at it if you get a copy of the. Come on, folks. There we go. Okay, let me go to the next slide then. Let me give you a certain view of the textbooks of moral theology. The purpose of the textbook in moral theology was not to teach ethical theory. It didn't tell priests or student priests how you arrive at what is good and what is evil. It does talk a lot about natural law, but as I said, natural law is something that is subject to scientific view, a scientific perspective. It didn't prepare clergy for becoming philosophers. It prepared them for hearing confessions, which means that it told them how to evaluate the penitent is confessing and determine if it is serious sin, mortal sin, it is less serious, or is it a daily sin? Does the penitent himself realize or understand that? Then he has to determine for serious sin, he determines the engagement of the penitent regarding their understanding of its seriousness. Did they know it was serious? What was their intention or their willingness to commit this act or omission? So there is a question of the penitent's engagement here. And then thirdly, it determines the penitent's resolve to avoid this in the future, which needs to be part of the act of forgiveness or for the request of forgiveness. And then finally to give the penitent a penance appropriate to the sins committed. This is what textbook theology was about. This is what it was helping priests learn so that they can work in the field and work with people in helping to order their lives in an ethical way. The result of this is are the presumptions of post-Tridentine textbook moral theology. And they are that, number one, sins are acts, including omissions, or things. They're almost looked upon materially, all right? Morality is about naming sins and inferring punishment. Intention does not affect objective sinfulness. There is an objective sinfulness in the act itself, and that cannot change because a person has a different intention. It is circumstances do not affect the objective sinfulness of an act. The objective sinfulness belongs purely within the act. If you want to look at how recent is this, you can go all the way back to 1993 in John Paul II's text Veritatis Splendor, in which he makes this a very, very big point of his teaching. We see that good can be thought of in absolute or intrinsic terms, if you like, and that evil can be thought of in absolute or intrinsic terms, which you like, all of which leads to the observation. What happened?
No, we lost the view of the PowerPoint there, Joe.
How can I do that again? Can I go back? Just go back to it?
I think so. Yeah.
There we go.
You have it. Yep. Thanks.
All right. What does this result in? This is a sin-oriented penitential structure, tends to focus on the individual and leave little room for the common good, the individual's responsibility, duty, or obligation to promote, achieve, and protect social justice. Those of you who may still be hearing confessions, when's the last time you heard anybody say, "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned. I have failed to achieve or to promote social justice"? That's hardly considered to be a sin. Now, is it? It's all about what you do and what you don't do. Okay, I hope I've given an adequate and not too detailed sketch of what I consider to be traditional moral theology. Now let's take a look and see what happens when we hit a point of crisis. Ethics in a time of crisis or an emergency. The tension between norms and customary behaviors begins to break down. Small clarification on that. What do I mean by customary behavior? Customary behavior is not necessarily a specification of what the norm is trying to say. It is a broader interpretation of what that norm is trying to say. Customary behavior is how we go about realizing that. For instance, the example that I mentioned before, a guideline that says you should always charge a reasonable price for your product, okay? When you get to the more ruled and normative way of doing that, the person who is hearing this, you should do that, everyone's going to say, but what about my product? What about my audience? What about the people I'm selling it to? You know, how big, how small? Are we in inflation? Are we in a financial crisis, et cetera? All of those factors have to be taken into account before anybody can know what is a reasonable price, okay? This tension between norms and customs, it begins to break down in a time of crisis. For instance, the persons who are responsible for protecting the well-being of all, or the common good as we call it, can be forced to take drastic measures. For instance, people are forced to do unusual things that they're not used to do. This is part of the result, the consequences of a crisis or an emergency. On the other hand, rights and freedoms may need to be modified or even curtailed, or new obligations imposed. Come on. People are prohibited from doing what they consider to be normal things. And this is precisely what has happened with the pandemic. People have been forbidden to do things a grandmother and a grandchild should not hug. They shouldn't even come close to each other. Or persons are responsible for protecting, say, no, we got to keep people apart because that's how they get infections. That's how the infections spread. So what happens with this? Norms and rules and laws tend to become exaggerated, right? Normally, rules and laws protect rights and freedoms. That's the job of rules and laws. Rights and freedoms are something we take for granted. They're always there. Are they absolute? Well, In this particular situation where people begin to interfere with this, we say, well, it doesn't look like the laws, the rules, the norms are normally protecting rights and freedoms. There's a strain that's going on here. But at the beginning of the academic, everybody's afraid. Most people are ignorant. We didn't even really know what we were dealing with. For instance, in the first 4 or 5 weeks of the pandemic, we still didn't know whether or not it was transmitted through the air. That had not yet been determined. And so a lot of people took different positions on issues that led to confusion. And they heard this virus is killing people, people are dying of it. This makes people afraid. Okay, so there's a strain going on, but people tend to follow this because they see something dangerous and they want to avoid that which is dangerous, that which is evil, which can be harmful. Okay, time goes on. In an abnormal crisis situation, rules and laws tend to limit these rights and freedoms. Okay, what does that lead to? That leads to a certain amount of frustration for people. After things become normal, maybe after 4 or 5 months of people are used to dealing with this pandemic, they begin to say, well, wait a minute, I'm not sick. People around me are not sick. Why should I, make my freedom smaller? Why should I give in to that? Why should I give up my rights? I'm not part of the problem. You're just interfering in my life. Eventually, this creates a tension between the normal pairs of rules and rights, or laws and freedoms, and saying these rules and laws are supposed to be protecting them and helping them. And now the modification of the rules, the modification of the laws appears that they're actually attacking them. And what do you get then? You get pushback. So people start saying that the ethics that people are shoving down our throats here is doing nothing for us. And not only that, they are destroying our rights and freedoms. Rights and freedoms become exaggerated. And that's precisely what happened. You see it in the news every single day. Last Saturday, there was a demonstration of about between 5,000 and 6,000 people coming to Brussels who were demonstrating against using a mask. All right, this is a violation of our freedom. It is a restriction of the rights that we have, etc. We look at it and we say, this is a very sad situation. But just think about this for a while. This is the way people perceive things. If it lasts too long, if it doesn't relate directly to the individual, they begin to think they're not part of it. It doesn't really apply to them. Okay, next step, a behavioral. Can you see all of this? Yes?
Yes.
Did anybody answer me? I hope
Yep.
you're seeing it.
We
Okay,
see it.
I've got all kinds of things on my screen here that I wish weren't there. A behavioral normative ethic is all about this or that, usually put in terms of black and white. Okay, these are simplifications. Sorry about that. I'm getting things coming up on my screen. They're simplifications. These such simplifications are exaggerations that demonstrate the weakness of a behavioral approach to ethics. Rather than ask, what should I or we do or omit, we should ask, what am I or are we trying to accomplish? Our focus should be on the end or the goal of whatever it is that we do or omit. What are we trying to achieve here? This is a different approach to ethics. It's an approach to ethics that will take seriously. Can you all see? All right, I can't even see myself anymore. We should be concentrated on the end or the goal. For instance, if we were to look at, if we're comparing a behavioral ethic or a normative ethic, we have a description of a behavior as opposed to, or in contrast to, a goal to be achieved. Let me give you a couple of examples. Here is ethical issues. Social distancing describes a behavior. If you impose social distancing, you should keep a distance. It should be 1.5 meters. It should be 2 meters or 2 yards or whatever you're saying, etc. Why? Why not more? Why not less? How do you determine that? And you'll have a big argument about the simple behavior, the structure of what is going on. Whereas you see it from the point of view of a goal to be achieved, the goal we're trying to achieve here is limiting infection. Now, if you start with that and you say, what we need to do is to limit infection, have fewer people getting infected, then you say there's a whole range of things that we might do. Social distancing can become one of them. And even if when it becomes one of them, you need to give it much more concrete application, right? And you need to be able to change those depending upon the circumstances. Okay, here's another example. Your internet connection is unstable. Wearing a mask, right? That's simply behavior. That's what these people in Brussels were complaining about last Saturday. Look at it from a different point of view, and you say, what we're doing is, if you can't limit the infection by keeping people apart because they're too close together, you need to do something to actually try and stop the infection from taking place. That's the purpose of wearing a mask. It stops the infection either from coming at me or my infection being passed on to someone else if I happen to have it. Because we know that people can infect other people even before they have symptoms and know that they're suffering from the virus itself. Another description of the behavior is basically serving the idea of being an individual. We're focusing on the individual behavior. Whereas if we're looking at the goals we're trying to achieve, we realize that we're talking about being a member of society. These goals we do together. Okay, I see I'm lost a little time here by the details. I'm back. We need to focus on this end or goal. Okay, and that's what I want to look at here. This is a different way to approach morality. Ends or goals are things that people are motivated to do. And why are people motivated to do certain ends or goals? It's because they have habitual tendencies. They have habits. The habits that we build up inform our motivation that leads us in the direction of achieving an end or goal. Quite simply, habitual tendencies are of three different kinds. When you are very young, your tendencies are all about needs. How do I get something to eat? How do I look after myself? How do I know that I have everything that I need? How do I know that mommy and daddy love me? This is what drives our tendencies. It's the thing that we're always looking for, and that's what motivates the small child. Desires are the more developed person, perhaps the teenager, the adolescent, and certainly the young adult. What is it that I see as good? I am attracted to things that I consider to be good. That's my desire. My desire also includes trying to avoid things that I consider to be evil or harmful. And then the third one is aspirations. As we become mature, as we broaden our view of the world and the whole life project that we share with other people, our aspirations tend to inform our habitual tendencies. Habitual tendencies, of course, lead to a basic life orientation. We become a certain kind of person. And becoming a certain kind of person, that kind of person has an effect upon the habitual tendencies that we have that need to be continuously developed. Okay? These habitual tendencies provide a direction towards which a person moves. We are either desiring something, moving toward it, wanting it, seeing it as advantageous, or it moves us to try and escape something, to get away from it because we see it as harmful or dangerous. By identifying specific goals or states of affairs that reflect the kind of life to which one aspires, this is our end or goal, to which one may commit one's efforts in particular sets of circumstances which lead to intention. And so when we start with habitual tendencies, which from the ethical point of view are referred to as virtues or vices, our virtues or vices shape our motivation, and our motivation leads us to look for what we want to accomplish. And after we consider all these circumstances, we figure out some way to achieve that and form an intention to say, that's the way I want to go. That's what I think we need to do, what I need to do in order to achieve this end or goal. And I can then make a choice of behavior. So as you see it outlined this way, if you begin your ethical understanding with something much more broad that is actually reflecting the way the personality functions, the way human beings work. It starts with tendencies that give us a motivation to seek goals and to form intentions to achieve those goals in a certain kind of way. So if we try to use a virtue ethics rather than a normative ethics, we're approaching it in a very different way. But we haven't yet solved the problem of idolizing the notion of virtue. Basic life orientation, by the way, from a theological point of view, is very much related to what is called fundamental option. How does one get from practicing virtue to choosing a behavior? Now, that's the tricky question, because this is the question that, as far as I was concerned when I was doing my research, hardly anybody ever addresses. Okay, if one absolutizes virtue, like many absolutize norms and laws, one would think that we always have to be courageous, always have to be obedient, always have to be patient, and so on and so forth. It looks like virtues are treated as absolutes, just like the laws were, just like the norms were. And this was a really, really big sticking point. I knew things had to change. I knew when you look at the textbook morality, when you look at what happened at Vatican II, that call for this change, that said we need to do things in a different way, we started looking for it. And moral theologians really try hard to do it. The literature between 1965 and 1970 is huge on moral theologians trying to figure out how to do this. Well, after I retired and I was in Georgetown at the Woodstock Theological Center, I was rereading things and trying to wrestle with this question. And I came back to what I frequently consider to be one of the most important articles written in the 20th century, namely Peter Knauer, the German Jesuit, his article on the hermeneutic function, the principle of double effect, which is published in McCormick and Curran's book, Moral Norms and Catholic Tradition. Okay, I've read that article. I've read it probably more, no. The articles I've read most were those from Louis Janssens, who was my mentor. But this one is the one that really stopped me thinking. I had to read it over and over because, to be perfectly honest, in my opinion, now we're really confused in writing this text. You know why he's completely confused? Because most of moral theology was completely confused at the same time. We didn't have a standard vocabulary. Nonetheless, there are gems in this text. And one of those gems is this. This is a quote from his article. He says, according to Aristotle, morally right behavior is a mean between two extremes which can be recognized as too much and too little. It is observed that the consideration of the good, the mean itself, is an extreme. Thus, bravery is a mean between foolhardiness and cowardice. Aristotle declared that bravery appears to be more closely related to one of the two extremes, foolhardiness. The observation, which is made by Aristotle himself with some surprise, provides an opportunity for asking whether there is not also a name for a right behavior which appears to lie closer to cowardice, the other false extreme. There is, in fact, prudence. It belongs inseparably with bravery. Now, I had to read that a number of times before I could really digest it. So here's another way of presenting it. I'll do it step by step. According to Peter Knauer, Aristotle formulated the theory that virtue is a mean between two extremes. Hope you're still with me. There we go. Foolhardiness and cowardice are the two extremes. Courage is the mean between the two. However, he also admitted, even to his own surprise, this is Aristotle, that the named virtue was closer to one of the extremes than the other. Courage was closer to foolhardiness than cowardice. So Knauer then asks, is there not another virtue that is closer to the opposing extreme? And he suggested that indeed there was prudence or caution. He used the word prudence. I avoid the word prudence because that's the name of another virtue. That's an intellectual virtue. Whereas caution is a much more practical one. And so there's caution, which is another virtue that is closer describes correct behavior, right behavior, which is closer to cowardice than it is to foolhardiness. And when you look at these together, what do you find? Every virtue has a complement. This is dealing with dangerous situations or with opposition. How do you deal with that? Well, before you decide how to deal with it, you have to understand it. And try and understand it, you need to take as much detail into account as possible. So in some situations, you're going to say, I need to use a good deal of courage here, right? Caution is not what I'm really interested in because it's such a drastic situation. And in others, you say, wait a minute. You not only endanger yourself in whatever you do, you can endanger others. And so therefore, you should experience caution. The point is that whatever we choose to do needs to be on these little dots, represent a continuum between courage and caution. And what we're trying to figure out, moral decision about what we're going to intend to accomplish has to be somewhere along that line. If it's not along that line, if it's totally to the right, it's absolute courage, any caution at all, that's foolhardy. If it's absolutely to the right and I'm only being cautious without any hint of courage at all, that's cowardice. What is morally appropriate is on the continuum in between. Now, let me give you just a couple more examples. All right, progress is considered by many to be a virtue. It is the mean between the two extremes of, on the one hand, exaggerated progress is seeking the new for its own sake. But a rejection of making progress, the rejection of any form of change is an unwillingness to change. If you think about this, it's quite obvious just from the word itself. Progress is much closer to seeking the new for its own sake, but not yet, than it is to unwillingness to change. Whereas fidelity to tradition respects change, it respects tradition, it respects the way things were, but it's not an unwillingness to change. You have here, again, when we're dealing with new things, you have the same kind of relation. We have two virtues which complement each other. If the one virtue completely ignores the other one, it falls into being an extreme. If the other one completely ignores the other one, it falls into an extreme willingness to change. Knauer gives 6 examples. I'm giving you 4 of them here. Zeal is another one. It is the moderation, the means between fanaticism and mediocrity. Haven't you ever thought, however, zeal really kind of looks like a form of fanaticism. And in fact, if you carry it too far and you don't have enough discretion, you will be a fanatic. Pure zeal. Nothing else matters. That's it. We don't think about discretion. That's fanatic. Okay. If you have only discretion and you have no zeal for change, no zeal for trying to accomplish what it is and putting your effort into it, you end up being mediocre. You don't really do anything. You don't improve anything. You don't really change anything. This is a commitment to a cause. The commitment to preaching the word of God, for instance, should be done with zeal, but take that zeal too far and it becomes fanatic. At the same time, it needs to include discretion. What's discretion? If you don't know the audience to whom you are preaching, you will just boil it down to some meaningless expression. And I end on this with one of my favorites. Hope, of course, is the medium between presumption and despair, right? But we all know that hope really is close to presumption. You hope too much hope is called presumption. What's its complement? Fear and trembling. These are examples that I take from Peter Knauer. Fear and trembling isn't quite despair. It keeps us on our toes, but it doesn't keep us on our toes so much that we stand still. We still look toward the future in order to figure out how we should be dealing with looking toward that future, etc. And so here I've developed this notion of complementary virtues. Actually, Peter Knauer had a good deal to do with it. But what he described in his article, that's it. He didn't say anything else about it. He didn't apply it to the rest of morality. He didn't apply it to ethics in general. But here was the key that he gave us for helping to understand. So And here I'm going to kind of bring this to a close, and I hope it's falling together as I reach my 40-minute time. Virtue addresses given aspects of a person's life with a habitual tendency to aim for a particular state of affairs. That's what virtue is. But virtues exist in a complementary fashion. These are synonyms. You can talk about courage or bravery, they mean the same thing. Caution and prudence means the same thing. Virtuosity takes place on a continuum. Virtue is not just being courageous. Virtue is not just being cautious. It means finding that place on the continuum between those two poles of what would be the best way to pursue. Virtuosity takes place on a continuum between the two extremes of the virtues. The extreme of courage is foolhardiness. The extreme of caution is cowardice. Between those two extremes, we are looking for a middle way. That way, the virtues are never reduced to an absolute. If we look at virtues absolutely, you're talking about extremes. Excuse me a moment. Now, I hope I haven't spoken too quickly. I hope I have made some kind of sense. If you'd like to know more about this, as I said, I'd be more than willing to send you the printout of these slides. Another place you can find this or find information about it is on my website. This is the URL of my website, www.christianethics.be. Okay, most people think when you go to that URL, you'll get there and you'll be at the home page of what you're looking for. Well, many times that's the case, but not always. Because in fact, when you call up a URL, the first thing that your browser looks for is not a file called home. It looks for a file called index. An index always precedes home. If there is no file called index, then it'll bring you directly to the home page. But if there is an index file, it'll bring you there. So the real destination, if you look for this in your web browser, it will bring you to this. That's where my web page is. It's at the Faculty of Theology at the KU Leuven. It's in their collection of applications. The name of my application is Christian Ethics, and the index for that looks like this. This is what you could call a come on page. The person who first sees that and first goes to www.christianethics.be, they'll see that screen. It gives us these provocative questions. And then it also says, you know, if you're really interested in looking at these more deeply, you can do so with this web page. Down here, you find a connection to the About page. We all know what the About page is, right? That's the page that nobody ever reads on a website. But there is an About page here, or you can go directly to the home page. And if you do go to directly to the home page, you'll end up with this. Same thing, KU Leuven, the applications, Christian Ethics, but now it is the home page, and it looks like that. Okay, now if I can switch over to this, I do. This is the actual web page. This is live. I just want to point out one or two things to you before I stop. This has got basically three areas. Here I discuss the history of Catholic Christian ethics, how it developed. Here I discuss the theory itself, how does it work? And here, this is a section I'm still working on sexual and relational ethics. If you go to the About page, you will find some hints about how to use this website, but they're basically hints. After the website was up for a while, some people started telling me it's difficult to understand, it's difficult to know where I am. And so I wrote this thing called How to Navigate Christian Ethics. And if you go to this page, the first thing you should read is this. It'll give you an overview of what that is about. Also, you can find a relation to a book that I published in 2016 that covers what I call reframing Catholic theological ethics. I don't know if you can see that because I can't see what you see. But what I just want to show you is one thing. If you go to the theory section, right, there's a whole section here that develops the concept of virtues. Where do virtues come from? What's a traditional virtue? What is the revised notion of virtue, and how virtues are related to goals? And if you want to see the concrete, how they are implemented, we have the development of habits, which are in fact 8 different files. that tell you what the virtues are. I've got a list of virtues in the book, but this one is more up to date. This one is more nuanced, and there's been a little changes in the wording, etc. But there's much more information there. So with that, I think I'm done. And I'm open and ready for questions if you'd like to ask some.
So, Dr. Selling, thank you so much for taking us through this process of moral thinking in this time of pandemic. And then we were able to see all of the PowerPoint throughout the presentation, and then also the website too. So I wanted to assure you that we could see you and also that website. So on behalf of the board, thank you for helping us to be creative in our virtual reunion because of the pandemic as well, and to give us something to think about theologically and pastorally. At this point, I'm going to stop the recording, and then we'll go ahead and navigate some questions.
Okay.